Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Whalenerds podcast. This is episode 146, and my name's Caitlin, and I'm here with a special guest, Alexander Brash, who is an author, and he was born and raised in New York, and his early love for birds turned into a passion for quantitative community ecology and then a devotion to conservation. He is a graduate of Buckley, Hotchkiss, Connecticut College, Yale School for the Environment, and he's also worked on Great Gull Island in the ornithology department of the American Museum of Natural History, and he earned a PhD at Rutgers. After a hurricane wiped out his study site, he took a job with New York City Parks and rose to the role of Chief Park Ranger, managing the agency's uniformed officers, Natural Resource Group, Communications, Historic House Trust, and special events. At New York City Parks, he initiated the Forever Wild Project, which now encompasses 47 park preserves covering over 8,700 acres, and Project X, the city's first program to reintroduce extirpated species. And he's also a first responder at 9/11. After nearly 2 decades at New York City Parks, he joined the National Parks Conservation Association as the Northeast Regional Director, lobbying for our national parks, bringing attention to the system's urban parks and cultural icons, and initiating the effort to establish I'm going to say this incorrectly, probably Katahdin Woods, Stonewall Inn,
Katahdin Woods.
Katahdin Woods. Thank you. Stonewall Inn and Patterson Falls as new national parks. Alex then spent 3 years as president of Connecticut Audubon, where he reinvigorated it by moving its finances back into the black, tripling its endowment and doubling the size of its nature preserves. Now living in Riverside, Connecticut, he's been consulting, writing, traveling, birding, and spending time with family. You're like a real life superhero.
Oh, I doubt that, but but I do love being outdoors, and I love all the creatures and plants that God created, and I like really trying to preserve them. And two of my favorite sort of side hobbies are rescuing wildlife and replanting native species. So
Awesome.
It all comes together from Mother Earth.
So basically, you're a birder, but also a closeted whale enthusiast.
I became a closeted whale enthusiast when I discovered the story. So
yeah. Oh, I'm a whale enthusiast, but I'm a closeted birder. So, I understand. So, I guess to kind of start off our conversation, I want to get maybe like a quick summary about what all the book encompasses so that we can kind of frame the rest of our conversation. And go ahead and you could just start with the book title if you want and just give us a little without giving it all away, maybe. I don't know.
I'll try, Caitlin. So, Caitlin, a Whaler Twilight was really just a found article, and that's what got me so deep into this. It turned out long ago and far away, I went on one of my first whale watching trips, and I was really just doing the bird part of it to identify the offshore pelagic species. And we had just such a wonderful experience with whales off Stellwagen Bank, which is off the tip of Cape Cod up Provincetown. And when I came back from that trip, I picked up the phone and I called my parents and I said, it was just the most unbelievable thing. And we saw the whales so close. And gosh, they are so empathetic. They actually appear so intelligent. They watched us on the boat and they swam around and so forth. And my mother, with barely a pause, said, Alex, you have a whale in your background. And I, in the, bliss or whatever it is of youth, sort of moved past that and had other things to do and jobs to get and people to see and work my way through life and ultimately, get a career and get married and so forth. And I never really touched on that for a long, long time. And then I finally had some time and I went back and I said, so Mom, what is this about this whaler? And she said, well, there's a map. And then I said, okay, so what else? And so then after a little bit, she said, well, come with me. And she took me into the back of her bedroom to a closet, and there on the floor, she said, pull out that trunk. And in this big old black leather trunk bound with brass hinges, were sort of all the things she'd been saving through a couple of generations on her side of the family. On the top were her little dance shoes from when she was, I don't know, 4 years old or something, all shriveled up and so forth. But that's what they were, with little pink ribbons holding them in place. And we went down through, at the bottom of the chest were a couple of folders and files and so forth. And so she said, well, pull that one out. And I pulled one out. And inside was a basic white Xerox of a handwritten manuscript. It turned out to be 100 pages long. And she said, well, try that. So I took that and I went home and I sat down on our front porch and I tried reading it. And it was what I could read was really cool and had me interested. And then it would fade out and there'd be almost whole pages where the Xerox just wasn't strong enough and I really couldn't
Mm.
make out the words. And then I was deeply chagrined. If I was embarrassed, I was like, I left this too long and the writing is faded, and what an awful, tragedy. I let this family tale go by and I didn't know what to do. And it finally, about 3 weeks later, I worked up the courage and I went back to my mother and I said, Mom, so is there any chance, there's another copy of this somewhere? She said, yeah, go back and look. And there below was another version that was sort of a 1930s mimeograph. And it was, in
Mm.
fact, sort of like the old purple mimeographs that used to be around in the 60s and 70s, but it was white writing on black paper. And this one was clear as could be. And I could sit down and read every single word. And then I realized it was such an interesting, fascinating story. It was the story of a whaler. It was the story of an ancestor. It was the story of his 10 years crossing the South Pacific. And it was, obviously a good bit about whaling, but it was more about his travails, the adventures, the people he saw. I mean, it's a really rollicking, crazy tale, where my great great grandfather, who's kind of lost, crisscrosses the South Pacific and he sees, obviously huge whales. He endures great storms. They come across mutineers and cannibals. And it's also really about him wrestling with himself. And it's a story ultimately of redemption. And so I took all that, I put it all together, and I sort of thought, well, maybe I'll just, get it done and I'll take it as uh, a simple publication back to someone like the Nantucket Whaling Museum or New Bedford or Mystic Seaport and, try to have it done as a shop kind of, in-house book. And then I was so fascinated with the story that I sort of hit pause for a moment. And then I spent the next 3 years sitting down and digging in and researching all the places he went, the other ships that he crossed, the people that he came across, the islands he visited. And, from that pulled out, probably a dozen or 2 dozen incredible stories that I could actually build into much greater, with much greater context and, shed light on who and where and what he was encountering. And it really opened up whole new story, if you will, and that's what really became the book. And so the book is sort of the first third is really about me finding the manuscript and a little background on his family and what I call the primer on whaling, because while he whaled during the golden years, whaling does have a fascinating history, as well as high points and a lot of low points. And then you get his real story of his time in his own words, and so this becomes a duet autobiography, as I refer to it. And then the last third of the book is really me going back and bringing in the historical context and having dug through incredible archives and stuff, the stuff that's now online. I could pull together and double and triple the size of his stories with finer detail, and really put them in a better light. And it becomes a deep dive sort of into American history. It's a period of expansionism. It's the founding fathers have now passed beyond, and the world is, the U.S. has been run by Andrew Jackson and is more covering expansion across the West and indeed now all over the South Pacific during the time he's there and what the ramifications were. Um, it's also, the book is frankly a perfect companion, nonfiction companion to Moby Dick, because he's out there barely 10 years after Herman Melville was out whaling, and they come and go to a lot of the same places, some of the same ships, and a lot of the same incidents or events happen. But in his case, they're all absolutely real and none of it's made up. So it's fascinating, that aspect. And then finally, I spent a little time near the end just getting a little bit in conservation and what's going on in
Hmm.
the world. And for someone like myself who was a conservationist all my life to then discover this tale of a man devoted to extraction, was quite interesting. And I wrestled with my heart and his heart, or our hearts and souls, over some of it. But there is some interesting, pieces that come out of it, and I will say it's also sort of slightly clear, reading between the lines, that he ultimately wrestled with his role, because I think a lot of what he did do, he underplayed when he finally wrote his tale. At the end of it, that's sort of the a whaler Twilight, and it is a whale of a tale.
Awesome. And so the main character, if you will, that's your ancestor, he's your great great grandfather, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
He's
So
my in a context, he is my grandfather's grandfather.
there we go. And his name was Rob, right? Or Robert?
Yes.
Yeah.
Robert Armstrong, but
Yep.
his wife called him Rob, so that's the name I used in the book.
Yeah. Very cool. So when like, what was the timeline when you actually got this manuscript? Was that within the last couple years, or like how long ago did this whole project start for you?
Oh yeah, no, I probably got the manuscript maybe in 2018.
Mm.
And as I said, I ultimately had it digitized, within a couple of months, and then I really worked on it through 2021, sort of almost up to COVID, and then by then, reached out to begin looking at publishers and so forth.
Very cool. And so you recreated some of his journey, and you started, I'm assuming you started locally with the history of New England and going to all of those places where they have archives and the museums and all of that, right?
As I became increasingly enraptured by his tale, which, being a family tale also has a little more poignancy to it. So, yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, indeed, one of the first places I went was to Baltimore, where he was born and raised and where he ultimately returned to. And that was his hometown. And so I went down and walked the streets and actually found his grave site in the cemetery.
Oh, cool.
In fact, it cost me $1,500 to have his stone put back upright, which had blown over
Oh.
some time, but it was all good. And fixed that up. And then I went up, and in an incredible revelation, I went to New Bedford, and I wanted
Hmm.
to go see the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And they have a great library. And I sort of went really just with some historical documents in mind. And I sort of wanted to see if they had logs of any of the ships that he was on from their captains. I wanted to just track down what happened to each of the ships that he was on, and a few things like that. And I got there and went in the library and asked for a few things. And the librarian, who at first was curt and then later turned around and became very nice and helpful, said, who are you really, who are you following up? I said, well, I have this journal from this guy called Robert Armstrong. And he's like, no, we have his logbooks. You can't have his logbooks. I have his logbook. He's like, no, we have his logbooks. And so he went in the back room and he pulled them out and he brought them up to my desk. And then I realized that they, in fact, had his logbooks. And I, took copious notes and photographs of each page, and then, used them later, A, to fill out the story, but B, and it took me about 2 months to parcel together, and from some letters that my grandfather had left also in the trunk, what had happened. And, what had turned out was these were the two logbooks from the two ships he was on, indeed.
Hmm.
And what I had was the autobiographical tale that he wrote much later in his life in his 60s. And so when he died, he had, thank God, 6 kids, because if he didn't have any kids, I wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
But I'm the product of the oldest daughter. So what I figured out was, once he dies and the kids break up the, quote unquote, the estate, and as children and family will do, I'll take that dresser, and I always like that spoon of mom's, and blah, blah, blah. And so the oldest daughter, my side, took the handwritten autobiographical manuscript. Her sister, middle sister, took one of the logs, and the youngest brother took the other. And then they all went their separate ways. And
Hmm.
then later in the 1930s, the middle aunt who was interested wrote to her younger brother, and said, can I borrow your logbook back? I'd like to, make a copy. And so she got it back and she made a Xerox copy in the 1930s and hand wrote some stuff and copied over some of the pictures, sent back the original, which then disappeared.
Mm.
But when she died, then at least one original and one copy were handed down. And ultimately around 2005, her great granddaughter-in-law, um, was in possession of both books. No one seemed to care, and that granddaughter-in-law sent them to the Bedford Whaling Museum, where then ultimately they remet. And so all three versions are now there today, including the autobiographer one.
Oh,
So
cool.
so they have it all. But it was a fascinating, and as I said, they helped flesh out the story and nail down a few dates. And there were some misspellings or something in his autobiography, which I could track back to his logbook and figure out. So it was very helpful. And it was, just an incredible, um, blessing in a way to be able to sort of have a secondary line of proof that what he'd written was all good and accurate.
Yeah. And did they end up having, so like the logs that he wrote, was that like the ship's record, or did they have other records from the ship he served on as well?
They must have had other records. On his first ship, I've never found the captain's logbook.
Mm-hmm.
And his, therefore, I think was in that light into your question. I think his logbooks were his own.
Okay.
Though he mimicked a lot of what was done. I mean, probably that's all, what he knew to do.
Yeah.
He very much mimicked, we took this whale today and she provided blank barrels of oil, or we stopped and we visited this ship, the North Star, and we gammed with them all night on this date. So he does do a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But on the second ship that he was on, in fact, I did find the actual log, and it was in the Nantucket Whaling Museum, and they digitized and sent me a copy.
Oh,
And
cool.
I used a couple of items out of that to augment his story in the book. I mean, the most interesting one was on the way home after he has finally seen the light and found redemption under the Southern Cross, and he's sailing back across the Southern Pacific Ocean, and they're still well west, but west of Cape Horn. They get hit by a series of gales, which nearly sinks the ship, according to the
Mm-hmm.
captain. The captain is terrified. All the sails are reefed. They, crack a boom or two. They pop a stay. The captain thinks they're going to go down. No one can eat for 2 or 3 days because it's so rough, and
Mm-hmm.
he says nothing of it, which is sort of interesting. Um,
He's like, this is what it is.
I know. I don't know. Either he got knocked down on the forward berth and didn't know, or he just, by then he was so into his redemption and heading home. But in any event, I inserted a couple of lines from the captain's log in the book to highlight, because it was, in fact, a pretty scary
Yeah.
episode.
Maybe he just was like, it doesn't matter if I make it, I make it. So he
Yeah.
just didn't even write it. I mean, I do that with my parents working in the Southern Ocean. I'm just like, yep, you wouldn't have liked today. I don't really say
Yeah.
how rough it was.
Yeah. Sometimes the things is better for people not to know.
Yeah, you don't need to know that the waves are up level with the bridge windows. That's okay. So, okay. New Bedford Whaling Museum is amazing. I've been before and I would go again for no reason other than to just go. I think it's pretty amazing the research archives they have, the workspaces that they have, but also just the amount of detail in the exhibits. I think it's a really incredible place. And when I visited there, I really kind of got this impression that like whaling was kind of the first like global maritime industry that connected everyone in the world. Like we were trading things on ships like wool and timber and spices and all that, but whale oil is something that like everybody got involved in. I don't know if you feel that same impression over the course of all your research and looking into all these things, but it really to me seemed like the first industry to connect all the different continents at such a large scale.
I think, in particular, it also moved people around.
Mm-hmm.
So Americans and Brits in the first, if not or near the first, as you say, um, global commerce. And instead of just ships of war, it's actually just people are out there, for business and for trade and so forth. And so I think it had a great impact in moving people around and sharing ideas and cultures and stuff. Probably not seen since, you'd think maybe the spice trade in the 1600s or something like
Yeah.
that. I think the other aspect about it, which I did not realize, but this story brings out, and in fact, even uh, my great great grandfather Rob is a good example. It's also the story of every man and the whaling industry, and that the whaling industry, sort of like the army, let's say, does today, would take in people from all places, all types, all classes, all socioeconomic stratuses, and it gave them a chance to sort of move up and get out in the world. And the crews were pretty much more everyman. I mean, everyone thinks that they're this very Nantucket and New Bedford based um, enterprises, but really that was simply the captains and the owners. The crews all came in from, all across the New England and the Midwest and so forth. And, even on his ship, which started out with 27, I forget, but somewhere up front, he sort of points out that 19 of them had never been to sea before. So,
Hmm.
um, it gave a lot of them a chance to, go see the world, which they otherwise wouldn't have. Um, they obviously didn't make a lot of money out of it. I mean, he in particular, he gets back after 10 years and he doesn't even have $5 in his pocket for all of his work. So in a way, it was also somewhat like an indentured uh, enterprise. But, he did get to go see the world, as did many of his compatriots who never would have.
And I imagine they picked up crew from different places and walks of life along the way as well. I mean, that's still pretty true in the seafaring industry that you just if you can work hard, you don't really get seasick and you want to go on an adventure, like let's go, get on the boat.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think it attracts, it attracts people sort of itinerant in nature,
Hmm.
because you're leaving, you're not coming back,
Yep.
uh, and so obviously it's pretty hard to have a family and that kind of stuff. So that I think that part of stuff, and the whaling industry. I mean, that's sort of it's one of the things I covered in the primer section of primer chapters, I call it. But what was equally interesting is, in the golden era and sort of the 18 and leading up to 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you really are getting, you'd say a reasonably high quality uh, young men heading out and looking to make money, looking to see the world, and so forth. Um, but then two big events transpire, or three if you throw in the sort of decline of the whaling industry. But the first year, the gold rushes, which then,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
there's not only the gold rush that we all know in California, it soon is branched out to Alaska, but there's also one going on over in Australia. And
Mm,
so
okay.
between all of them, that sucks off a lot of manpower. Then, of course, you have the Civil War, which sucks off a lot of manpower, and
Hmm.
a lot of young men are paid to go in the army instead, much less being drafted. So that really changes. And so, towards the end of the golden era of whaling, the labor force really deteriorates, frankly. And so they start, using a lot more islanders, some of them happy, some not happy, many of them getting on board and quote unquote signing a contract, which is an X on paper about something they don't even know and they can't really read. And, they think they're going out for a 1 week voyage and making money and coming back, and they're taken for 2 years or
Yeah.
three, and they jump ship. And so you have a lot of issues, more and more convicts are brought in. And so then, that probably all leads to more friction on board ships. It's hard to know whether it's the cart before the horse, but, the captains start acting tougher because the crew's not as willing. And so then you end up having more mutinies and, begins going south pretty quickly. And then, of course, it's all finally pretty much wrapped up by 1880s, 1890s as oil is discovered in the ground in western New York State and Pennsylvania, and that pretty much closes out the industry.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I kind of when I explain to people like what happened with whaling, like why did we stop? I mean, it would be lovely to say, "Oh, we protested in the 60s and like everybody saw the light." And it's like, "Well, there was competing, it was economic drivers, and also just like logistically it was harder to do, and we had an alternative product coming available on the market to compete, and you know, so it was harder to find the whales, harder to meet the demand, and we had something easier to replace it. And then the legal action came in when people really started to express their opinions. But whaling had already been on its way out for a long time before we got to the, international moratoriums and the federal bans in different countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the saddest aspects to me, and I discussed it in the book, is sort of the as you were touching on the sort of the end of whaling, which even after the native oil drops off in the 1880s and 90s, then it sort of goes quiet. We go through two wars, but then there's the awful notion of the tragedy of the commons, and that is, at the end of World War II, you have surplus men floating around, you have surplus steel ships floating around. The whales are not owned by anybody, and
Mm-hmm.
so a bunch of nations, including the U.S., all just go out, and it probably wasn't even cost effective, but it was better than nothing, and it was free, and so. And in many ways, it almost became a race. Let's just take them all because they're not owned by anybody.
Yeah.
No one's responsible. And it finally, they even create a whaling commission, which is entirely run by the commercial side of things.
Yeah.
So there's no break on the take until finally in the 60s, there's a pushback and the scientists kind of rise up, shortly after and around the first Earth Day, fittingly. And the scientists say, wait a minute, this is just completely, uh, off the charts and doesn't make any biological sense, and we're wiping out what we have, but by then the blue whales are down to just a few thousand, and they're so few and far apart they can't find each other, and they're still, incredibly suppressed as a population.
Yeah.
Others have been able to bounce back, but it was a true tragedy.
Yeah. I really have the impression after working in South Georgia this season, and going to the Falkland Islands, which you've been as well, um, that towards the end, like in that era of whaling post World War II, especially, we were just trying to like make up products to use whales
Yeah.
for, because we were still taking them, but like oil wasn't really the thing anymore. So we're like making soap and like trying to still produce like margarine and coming up with these things to do with the bone meal. And it was like we were trying to make up products to justify the industry still. And then you look at the history of all those whaling stations in South Georgia, there was an oil surplus in the 30s. A lot of them closed. Some of them converted to like servicing the ships that were still working. Factory ships were starting to go offshore outside of federal jurisdiction for anybody. So it was just whaling on the high seas. And yeah, towards the end, it really just felt like they were trying to just keep the industry going for the sake of keeping the industry going.
Yeah, yeah. And the same thing happens today. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, I was working on the establishment of Katahdin Woods National Park, um, which was a project for a long time and it's finally is established. The bigger picture is behind it is there's the possibility for a 1 million acre Maine Woods Park, which would be the size of Yellowstone. But to this day, there are a number of residents up in northern Maine who fight it as though they're still saving, the wood industry, the pulp and paper industry, which
Mm-hmm.
long ago left. I mean, before any of this even occurred, the Maine's northern woods had already dropped from something like 11 wood plants, wood and paper plants to one. And so it really had nothing to do with the park. It's just people were fighting, for the dream that they had, that their parents grew up in, and it's noble and it's sad, but it was a long gone dream. And instead, the much better possibility is to make a beautiful national park up there, the size of Yellowstone, that would hold moose and lynx and wolves and so forth, and bring far more in the way of economic activity to the region. But it takes people a while to come around and see it.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like humans are funny that way, right? Like old habits die hard, and like we don't want to let go of things that we consider important to our culture and history when, even when the facts are on the table, that it's like that's not the way to go.
Right, right.
So I, the other thing is like when I look at those whaling stations and I like talk to people about whaling history, like I can't deny the fact that like we are who we are as a society and as an industrialized world. We needed them. Like we didn't become who we are today without them. It's like the Industrial Revolution was lit by whale oil, so our factories could be open at night, and our world advanced, from the oil we got from these whales. So it's kind of a weird, I don't know, like it was never a necessary evil in my opinion, but like it is what we revolutionized our world on.
I think that's fair. I mean, I've always thought
Yeah.
that, and that's a tough discussion these days,
Yeah.
because I think there's a lot of people who like to go back and judge, use today's judgment or today's ethics to judge something, in past history. And I think like you on that score, I've never been a fan of that. I think, you can't do it. It's not fair anyway.
Hmm.
And certainly, as I equally point out in the whaling chapter, early whaling was a noble slash heroic endeavor. It was dangerous. It was hard. They would go out, they wouldn't get them all the time. It was six men in their little boat and harpoon against this great Leviathan, and it crushed boats and smashed people and drowned them and so forth. Um, and it was at least noble pretty much through the time of this story. It's only, frankly, post World War II with the steel ships and, huge guns
Yeah.
driven by steam and so forth that's no longer has any notion of that.
Yeah, I feel like it's a more romanticized story when it's like you're still on the sailboat and you're still rowing the whale boats, and you're not processing on a big factory ship with steam engines, and like the fight was a little more fair when everything was man and wind powered.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you, now that you've gone through all this process of, looking at this history with your family, getting to know more about the whaling history, and I mean, you're familiar with logging history anyway, but what your great great grandfather participated in New Zealand, um I don't know, I guess how do we like reckon with these extractive industries that we've created? Like, I guess what are some of your reflections on what happened, what we participated in.
Um, I think as you equally touched on a minute ago, it is hard to take, today's morality and shift it back in time, and certainly not
Hmm.
fair. One would hope we would have learned lessons. I mean, one of the things I particularly learned and noticed down in New Zealand, um, as a birder, for example, um, when you visit New England, I mean, when you visit New Zealand, there's not a lot of natural park preserves left. There are a few, but most of at least the North Island where I was, um, has been cut, cleared, replanted, and so forth. There are forests. There's lots of forests. They are pure, pine and conifer plantations, a few hardwoods, but mostly these great monocultural plantations.
Hmm.
Um, the more striking aspect of New Zealand in sort of conservation is there was a wide open invasion of species from Europe
Hmm.
to a island that had never had mammals or terrestrial animals. And so, all of the native birds at the time of first contact were sort of nesting on the ground almost,
Yep.
like the kiwis and so forth. And so, what it really has done, besides all the clearing and so forth, even in the remaining tracts of quote unquote wilderness, there are very few native species because they've just all been wiped out by invading, everything from weasels and cats and rats and so forth, that have just decimated. And it'd be sort of like trying to come to America to see something as beautiful and as reasonably common as a cardinal or a blue jay, which are, we're all used to them because they're very common backyard species, but are actually beautiful birds. But if the only place you could see them would be if you went off to Nantucket or
Mm.
Martha's Vineyard or some island off the coast. And when you go to New
Hmm.
Zealand, most of the species you can really only see off the main coast on a few islands that never were invaded. And so
Mm.
that part to me was more troubling in many ways and very sad. Um, you know, the forests sort of they're working hard, and New Zealand now has incredibly great ecological culture, and they are doing the best they can. And a lot of these large park reserves they've sort of fenced off, and they have intense trapping programs, and they're doing a lot of native species plantings. Um, but anyway, it was fun and fascinating to go and see the great trees up north where he harvested, and then in particular to follow, as I say, follow in his path, because I was fascinated to go where he could. And in his book, in his autobiography section, my great grandfather actually was very specific in his reference about where he went on North Island, in particular down around Hawke's Bay, which is on the south side. Exactly where he was in the town of Waiora and up the river, and I could go there, and it was fascinating to be 160 years later, literally, I probably was within a few feet of where he stood and walked and camped and lived.
Hmm.
And so that was really cool and very touching. And it also made me appreciate how far away he was. When you think back 160 years ago, obviously there's no phones. Um,
Yep.
he wrote a couple of letters on his whaling ships. None of them ever made it home.
Hmm.
So by the time he's there, he's now 7 years away from having left Baltimore in shame at his drinking habits. And he is as far away as you can be on this earth. I mean, he is literally antipodes. He's the opposite side
Hmm.
of the earth.
Yep.
No one knows he's alive. He has no way to communicate. He is,
Yep.
as lost as he could be. He's really got no friends, no family, and he's out there struggling with his own identity.
Hmm.
And it also brought home to me something which was, you know, the various facets of substance abuse was
Yep.
something I had not really, thought about before. I have enjoyed drinking and so forth in my time, but I've always thought of, self-discipline, you stop when you want and so forth. And I realized he was not capable of that. And it made me, as I dug into it, realize that there are, in fact, a lot of people who are not capable. It is deeper than just self-discipline. It is a physiological genetic issues, and some of it is beyond probably most of our understandings, but it's not rational. And that was sort of scary and interesting all in the same light, and heartrending to think about this poor guy at that point, 7 years from home and from family, and he's wrestling with that. And that's after, 7 of those years at sea and in New Zealand, where he's trying to sort of break the habit by distance. And even then he can't,
Yeah.
though it looks as though he finally did. But
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not unfamiliar with the struggles of substance abuse and addiction in our family. But it's incredibly isolating, like in itself. Like you can be on an island even when you're at home, when you're battling with something like that. So then being a whole world away, not having communicated with your people who hopefully would support you for 7 years, I mean, that's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
incredibly hard.
yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
well, I'm glad he was able to. I mean, it's nice and it's appreciated when people are candid with what they're struggling with, even though this person lived generations before you. Like just seeing it kind of laid bare. Like, not only is this the struggle of being gone and signing up for an adventure that you got way more than you bargained for, you also are contending with this other thing. And that's the reality. I mean, and it's still the reality in a lot of what's left of the logging industry. It's absolutely a part of the seafaring industry still. And so it's in some ways like not a whole lot has changed. There are resources for people, there's rules and regulations and things like OSHA. Um, but yeah, I mean, contending with the demands and physical exertion of the industry and then balancing how do you decompress
Yeah.
is definitely something that still happens today. So you went to New Zealand. You also went on a trip to go around Cape Horn, right? And you went down to Antarctica as well.
Yes, and that was a surprise, actually. I was fascinated. as you brought up earlier in my quick bio, but I was born and raised in New York City, became very fascinated with birds at an early age. And my first paying jobs in high school and college were working at the Museum of Natural History, where I got a job in the ornithology department, and I would shuffle birds and trays around, as well as help other researchers identify birds. When they had a picture of a species, they want to figure out what it was, and various things like that. So, um, having spent a lot of time in the museum, then one of the things I would do is go out midday and take a lunch break and go stroll the hallways. And of course, one cannot but fall in love with all the beautiful dioramas there that cover all the animals and so forth in Africa and Asia and so forth. And one was the world of birds, and uh, one of my favorites, just because to me it was about as wild a place as could be, were the pelagic seabirds. And the two great places in the world to see them were both Cape Horn and then now off New Zealand. Uh,
Hmm.
so in one trip, I went down and I found a bird group that was signed up on board of a fairly large ship, kind of a cruise ship, but it was a sort of a separate group, and the cruise line was very nice. They gave the 20 of us and our two guides a separate deck so we could just hang out, and we were basically on the deck from dawn until dusk. And then after that, I would retreat to my room and write down my notes and maintain my logs and diary and so forth. Um, but in any event, I signed up, and the trip was sort of advertised around Cape Horn. I thought that's great, so did that, and the ship left Montevideo and went down, and we stopped at the Falklands, and I frankly had not really read the fine print, and the ship was going down to the Antarctic Peninsula for 3 days, which was fine because I in fact wanted to cross Drake's Passage, and so it was cool, but I was a bit surprised. Thank God at the last minute, like literally 2 days before we're going to go, my wife pointed it out, and so I threw in a couple of down vests and some extra long johns, or I would have been in deep trouble. Um, but
Would have
I
spent a
just,
lot of money at the ship store.
yeah, but was so fascinated because for someone who loves pelagic seabirds, you go down on the Atlantic coast and you see a lot of the birds that you would see off the West Atlantic that are up off New England in the summer.
Hmm.
We're all down there. And then we touched and cross Great Passage, come back, and then we go up the west side, or come up on the west side, and so we're coming up next to Chile on the Humboldt Current, and it's an entirely different array of birds. Many of them ecologically, they look quite similar. They're
Hmm.
on specific offshoots and so forth. Um, but they're Pacific, and they're all different named, and they all have different breeding colonies, and they're all broken out ecologically differently. But it was fascinating sort of get the two seas at once, where they co-joined.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I learned the birds because they're by the whales. But
exactly.
I also am out on deck looking for whales at the same time that all the birders are out. And so it's a good kind of like camaraderie and banter out on deck. And, we take turns being in the front or being in the back, looking around for things. And it is pretty fun, especially when the big seabirds are following the ship to take photos and just watch him play around with the draft off the ship. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so what did you think of Antarctica?
I was glad I was ever going to colonize it. y- you know, I mean, our ship was big enough that we didn't land. We just toured by the way,
Okay.
and they got us in pretty close. Um, pretty inhospitable. I
Yeah.
mean, you're basically looking an entire continent of nothing but rocks and ice.
Yep.
You never see anything green, or at least we didn't. The penguin colonies, of course, are fascinating because there's millions of birds.
Yeah.
Um, we did bypass a couple of the human colonies, and so, some were big. Argentina has one that's, I don't know, must be 50 Quonset huts and so forth.
Yep.
And then we passed one owned by Ecuador, which was nothing more than a container. I mean, the kind of container you see in the back of an 18-wheeler,
Yeah.
and they put it up on a beach with a flag. No one's there. They say the guide on the boat said, "Oh yeah, they show up 1 week a year and someone sleeps there and flies the flag and then that's it." Um, but it also brought out, to me, some of that trip also brought out, which is in the politics of the region, and it takes you back to the Malvinas Falkland War.
Oh yeah.
And, it had never occurred to me. I thought, there's something real there, blah, blah, blah. But it really turns out it's frankly the notion that ultimately, if the trees on Antarctica ever fell apart, that the nations would divide up Antarctica
Mm-hmm.
into
Totally.
wedges like a pie, and it would be based on how big an area you cover. And so Argentina, which is wide at the north and narrows at the south, would only get a very small slice. However, if Argentina also owned the Malvinas, um, way to the east, then its pie slice would be much, much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And also they're arguing over fishing rights and so forth. But, it brought it out that it was never really about the people on the Falklands, um, of which there were never any indigenous ones. It was all just about, the fight for hypothetical wedge out of Antarctica in the future.
Yeah, and now especially in light of the permitting and licensing that the Falklands makes their money off of, that's definitely a big economic motivator to have control of who sells those licenses to the commercial fishing industry.
Right.
Um, but yeah, Argentina and Chile, it's pretty interesting when you see how many bases they have. Some of them are occupied all year, some of them are occupied by families. So they have children being born in Antarctica at those bases, and there's schools, and like they're ready. If something falls apart, they're already occupying
Mhm.
Antarctica.
Yeah. Yeah.
So pretty wild. But yeah, it's like being on another planet, but you're still on Earth when you're down there, is how I feel. So
But the birds were not as interesting as they were in the Drake's Passage,
yeah.
because by the time you're close to the continent itself, it's pretty slim pickings. But still, it was fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of the same for the cetaceans. Like when you get down to the peninsula, it's like mostly humpbacks, maybe minke whales, maybe killer whales. If you're lucky, then something else shows up like a blue whale or like some sort of beaked whale if you're in deep water. But it's more as you exit, like out on the Shetland Islands, and then as you come
Right.
into the continental shelf again of South America, that things get interesting. So, um, yeah. So how through this whole journey, what do you think maybe in Rob's logs, what's left the biggest impression on you? If
I think
or
that
maybe there's nothing. I don't know.
no, I mean, I'll touch on two things which were interesting. One was, which I referred to much earlier, but one was, it was indeed fascinating to um, realize where he was and what he did and how much whaling he actually did. And the other part of it is on the way out, they stopped at the Galapagos Islands for a week and realized that they would have to have, like every other whale ship, taken a lot of the tortoises.
Yep.
So, one thing that was interesting to me, and I guess reflective in a good way, was he matured with time. And so, from what he did in his 20s when he's doing this, um, to when he actually writes this in his 60s, and by then he's back, he's redeemed, he's got family, he's, in Baltimore, risen in the vestry of his church and so forth. And so he leaves out a lot of these, what I consider dirty details.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I guess that's good. Um, the other thing that really struck me through all this was then having, as we also just covered, followed in his path to the seas of New Zealand, to the seas around Cape Horn, just how imperiled they are now, and how, as a lifelong conservationist, what I'm also now really noticing is two trends are, I think, bedeviling what was, and certainly since the first Earth days, a notion of trying to um, preserve the biodiversity, the biota and the flora and fauna of our planet. And some notion that we could ultimately be good partners and live with it and still live with a snow leopard in the Himalayas and live with a jaguar in the mountains of Arizona and so forth. And that we seem to be forever being pulled further and further from that. We now are leaning far more into just a sort of a very anthropocentric view, and that the planet will, and I mean, is now, and certainly will in the future, be completely dominated by humans. Um, Wilderness areas will basically just be large zoos caged off. And we will no longer have any kind of parity with the other living creatures around us. And some of it's also come out in sort of two recent trends that I observe. And one is, um, with this proliferation of TV shows and movies and all sorts of things. It's BBC and Attenborough and worldwide of this. Um, I think there's a tendency of a lot of people to think this stuff has been saved because you can go
Mm-hmm.
on and you
Yeah.
can see on the screen a beautiful whale and you can see the snow leopard and so forth. Um, and people have sort of have now averred from going on these trips to actually go out and see it and feel it. It's too difficult. It's not that exciting. And the other more recent trend is climate change, and climate change is real and is very important and will threaten our existence. No doubt on
Mm-hmm.
any of that. But it's also sort of it's also steered everyone away from the our long efforts at just simply biodiversity. And I think too many younger people, too much conservation effort now is into, carbon credits and
Mm-hmm.
all the kind of lingo that goes with climate change, which, not to belittle it for a minute, but what it has done is really, so to speak, suck the oxygen out of the room on simply preserving our biodiversity and our wild spaces. And I think that's sad and very dangerous. And I think we, really need to think what our future is, and what kind of planet we humans want to live on for eternity.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. Like the biodiversity part of the conversation sometimes really falls to the back, and you're like, well, that's what makes our planet function, is that there all are all these different components and they do work together in ways that we don't understand. And so if we start, leaving them out of the conversation, then we really are going to make a bigger mess than we've realized. I mean, you could say that especially for whales. We had no idea what role they played in the ecosystem when we were taking them out by the thousands. And now, like within the last 15 years, we're like, oh, they play a huge role in nutrient cycling. Like, of course, there's a reason why these animals got so gigantic in such large numbers, feeding this low in the food chain, because they have an important job.
They didn't get so large without having an impact.
Yeah,
Vice
exactly.
versa. Yeah.
So, as a conservationist, what would you like? Is there any advice you would give to people that are, just grappling with like, what do I even do? Like what can I do to help?
I think the best thing to do, and a great guy, Richard Louv, wrote a book about it. But I think the best thing one can do is get out and see the world. I think the
Mm-hmm.
most important thing I would urge everybody who's young to get out and go to the farthest reaches, to go into the jungles, go climb the mountains, go see the stuff, because I think that alone, will wake people up to the inherent beauty of the natural world around us. And from that they'll see what needs to be done, because then people can work at their own levels and their own interests, and whether, we're all of us different, and some of us like to work on a micro project, some like to work on a big project.
Yep.
But if you get out there and you actually, have a tangible interaction with some of the most beautiful places in the world, some most spectacular species, beautiful flowers, trees, whatever, from the sequoia to the dara tree to the whatever, you'll get involved, and that's probably the best thing we could do, and also begin to learn and show it respect. And my notion and my hope is to head towards a world of some better parity.
Yeah. Yeah. I usually tell people like put the environment in your decision making process, whatever that looks like for you. If it means you can set aside time every week to do something, maybe you just make some changes in your routine. It's not a one size fits all. There's no one, we can't all just get rid of
Right.
plastic straws and say it's saved. So,
It'd be a little more work than that.
yes, if it was that easy, it would be saved a long time ago. But in kind of in a positive light, especially in regards to whaling in the southern oceans, like we're starting to see populations really recover, especially humpback whales are doing quite well. This year we saw quite a few southern blue whales. I saw two outside of Shag Rocks in South Georgia. We saw two southern right whales on that trip as well. And so, like, things are in some places, things are coming around, but it's definitely not a reason to sit on our celebrate our success and do nothing more. I think it's motivation to keep going because some things are working. But
Yeah, no, because I know the right whales are certainly struggling in the North Atlantic. They're down
yes,
to just a few hundred, and there's the
yes,
endless, is it collisions with ships or is it lobster pots? Okay, it's both.
yep,
Uh, but that is not a population that's recovering well. They're
no,
equally in danger in the Northern Pacific.
yep,
Um, and so, some of them need help. The humpbacks, I agree, seem to be doing really well. And I saw plenty myself when I was down in Antarctica, which was very
hmm
cool. And it sounds like now the killer whales are struggling in a big way, and in many ways we don't know. And they're
hmm
different cultures, which I think is also a fascinating aspect.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this subspecies conversation goes in the Pacific Northwest because, yeah, if you manage them all as one species and they clearly have different needs and need different regulations and considerations, it's pretty dangerous to do it with an old model. You will just see an entire category of killer whales disappear if you do it that way. And so, hopefully, um, we'll see what happens. We'll just I hope they split them so that they can manage them better and manage them differently. But yeah, it's been as someone from the Pacific Northwest seeing this population of killer whales just be in the news my whole life, and I'm like, okay, it's been quite a few decades at this point, and we still have not sorted this out.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And hopefully, as they restore the salmon into the rivers off Seattle,
yep.
in the national park there, and that will then bring back enough of the food items to at least help those killer whale populations, which would be great.
Yeah, and that's another one of those like old habit die hard conversations. Like we don't really need all those dams on the Snake River anymore, but they haven't come down yet.
Yeah, yeah.
So humans, we're in our own way. So as we wrap up, I want to just give you an opportunity to let people know where they can purchase the book. It's A Whaler at Twilight, a true account of whaling and redemption in the South Pacific. I see it on Amazon. Is there any other places that people can order it?
I believe it's on Amazon, and it certainly was on Barnes and Nobles. And you can always go visit alexbrash.com, and there are links there that not only tell more about the book and a little background on me, but also where you can buy it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the whole thing. I read some snippets and things before, but I'm like really excited to get all the way through it now. So, thank you so much for being on. This is an awesome chat about history and whaling and things that we've both seen and done. And I just want to say thank you to everybody that listened as well, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode.
Thank
Bye.
you, Caitlin.
You're welcome. Bye.